In the way that Revelation brings that call of transformation to the table is by painting vivid pictures of Jesus, constantly describing this the incarnation, this Christocentric logic of how to even process the world that we are living in, the realm of Rome, which the way I describe it is what Revelation's constantly doing then is trying to thin the veil. It's trying to, this veil that separates us from God, from our ability to see God in the world around us, the veil that separates humanity from divinity, and even frankly separates us from our own enemies. Revelation thins consistently to try to say, whoa, what you think you see actually is much more profound in both negative and in positive ways than what you've even been able to discern.
Welcome to Grail Country. My guest today is Dr. Shane Wood from Ozark Christian College, where he's a professor of New Testament studies. And he has written a book on the book of Revelation. It's called Thinning the Veil. And as his brother happens to be a friend of the channel and a frequent guest. And we've done previous series on the book of Revelation here on Grail Country. So I thought it would be a subject of interest to the audience. So I thought it would be a good idea to bring Shane on to Grail Country to talk about the ideas that he expresses in his book. So with that said, welcome to Grail Country, Dr. Wood.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So why Revelation? What made you decide that was going to be a subject of academic specialty and study for you?
Yeah, primarily because growing up in the church, we never talked about it. And curiosity tends to do what curiosity does. And it contains more questions for me than it did answers. And so my undergrad, I dove into it as soon as they would allow me, and then ended up doing my master's thesis on it, and then eventually even my PhD on it. And so it's a book that's had a hold of my heart for quite some time, but for basically the reason the church is just that I grew up in just neglected it.
Right, that's interesting. So I had the opposite experience growing up, because in my childhood we were Pentecostal, mostly Assemblies of God, but some other but very much in the Pentecostal world, and it's the opposite extreme where it's just like Revelation is like front and center. Yeah. Very important. And so I just I fell away from the tradition I was raised in at a very young age. I had a very intellectual kind of demeanor and bent and orientation, and it's not exactly the most intellectually robust tradition, or at least it wasn't when I was a kid. And so I was agnostic by the age of 12.
Wow. Okay.
And I didn't really think much about Revelation, except, but then I kind of returned to it like later on. We've actually, like I said, we've done a couple of series on the book of Revelation previously on this channel. One of them was from an obscure little book called The Apocalypse of John by Emil Bach, who was an anthroposophist follower of Rudolf Steiner. And I read a review that Owen Barfield had written about his book that was very positive. And it's like, okay, maybe I'll take a look at this weird book and look at Revelation with fresh eyes. And obviously the way Bach reads Revelation was nothing like the way I was taught to look at Revelation when I was growing up. And then I've also done, my friend Jedediah and I have done an incomplete series that we'll probably get back to one of these days, on Bulgakov's dogmatic interpretation of the Apocalypse of John. So it's something that I have kind of renewed my interest after being burned by it.
Sure.
From the opposite reason, right? You got curious because it was ignored, and it's like I kind of like just wanted nothing to do with it because I was sick of hearing about it. But then at some point later on, I came back around and it's like, okay, maybe I need to reconsider this again. One of the things that really But I don't know if Jordan warned you about what this about this channel or not.
He didn't warn me about anything.
Okay.
I wouldn't believe him even if he said it.
Right, because it's like, okay, because my channel is a little bit weird because it's like I talk about theology a lot, but I'm not really a part of Christian YouTube. Now, I'm a Christian, but I do a very different kind of thing than what Christian YouTube does, and I'm also not an academic. So it's like I might seem to come at you out of left field sometimes.
That's all right.
So just be prepared. So anyway, yeah. So okay, I lost my train of thought. Just really quickly, actually, while I try to recover my train of thought, I just wanted to say about your book before we get into the details. Oh, I remember what it was, but I want to say something complimentary about your book first. I was really impressed with your writing style, and this is like, this is the kind of book that I think it's really cool to find an academic book that is so approachable. And so written for, like, I think I would recommend this. This is the kind of book that I would recommend to my mom, even though it's published by an academic press. It's like, oh, okay, like this is a book that everybody can benefit from. And the reason that I think everybody can benefit from it is because the way you approach the text is that the way you want to see the text is very similar to one of a figure that's important to me. Valentin Tomberg wants to see the text because Tomberg says that what the book of Revelation is, he talks about people talking about the interpretive key of Revelation having been lost. And what he says is that Revelation is a set of spiritual exercises. And I think the way that you're wanting to approach Revelation and read Revelation as in a book that can transform us if we approach it the right way is very much aligned with that. So when I read a synopsis of what you were doing in the book, that made me interested in reading it. And now I've read it and I'm excited to talk to you. And so tell me about like what your approach to the book is, how it differs from approaches that people might be familiar with, that they've encountered in the past, and why you think it's important, why we should read it, and what the benefit of it is.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that complimentary even comparison. And I was actually grateful that IVP Academic allowed me the levity to play. I eventually, where I land on it now is it almost turned out to be a book where I envision almost like Eugene Peterson, Richard Bauckham, and myself sit down, and this is the book that comes out.
Right.
It is, but I do think, and I teach this where I teach at Ozark Christian College. I teach my students. I say that the best way to do biblical studies is to unearth the text with all of your tools, but then to allow the text to unearth you as well. Bringing all of yourself to the text so that then the text, as you are engaging it is engaging you. And so there's this reciprocal really union, this reciprocal unearthing that's occurring. And that's what I tried to demonstrate in the book is really this kind of methodology. So definitely the book, dives into some of the deep exegetical components of, some of the intricacies of Revelation 14 and who really are the ones being trampled in the winepress, and Revelation 17 and some of the parallels to, the foundational myth of Rome. And so there's definitely that exegetical bent to it. But I begin the whole book out, I believe, quoting from my journal at like 3 a.m. whenever I'm wrestling with loneliness and God. But I think that the biblical authors were bringing all of themselves to the text. Yeah. And I too think that that's how we should read it. That's how we should engage it.
Well, it also gives us this pastoral dimension because of the way, because you are so deeply personal and vulnerable in the way you decided to write the text. It has like this sort of really deep pastoral element to it. Like this book, like I could give it to my mom. I could also this is the kind of book I would go to my priest and say, hey, if you ever want to teach a course on Revelation, you should really use this book as a guideline to teach the course. And it's the way it's laid out, it could be done. You could do that with it.
Sure. Yeah.
So
yeah, well, and that's where at the end of each of the chapters too, and because I also had no intention of covering every single theological or exegetical detail in the text. It's not a commentary. But then there's videos at the end of each chapter where they can dive deeper into me teaching on the mark of the beast and on the rapture and But yeah, so there are avenues for different ways of employing the book to dive into it, frankly, across the spectrum, from people that have either had been burned from churches that were obsessed about it, or even those that had it neglected completely.
Yeah, I know. I didn't watch your videos while I was reading the book. I waited until I finished the book and then went back. I kind of like looked at the videos today.
Yeah.
And I was, because I was doing something that was kind of, I was like listening to them while I was working. And one of the videos you actually talk about like the two different extremes, and like both of us are representative of that, right? Because you come out of one extreme and I come out of the other extreme. And then so you mentioned, I don't know what order I want to tackle things, but I think we should talk about like some of the things that you address in the book that are like some of people's maybe possibly misconceptions. But you mentioned the mark of the beast. So why don't you, I don't know if you actually, I know you treat that in one of your videos. I don't know if you actually treated it in the text of the book.
No, in the book, I made that intentional. So there were some intentional moves I made in the writing where my goal was to pull the thread of the heartbeat of the book and not get really lost in not losing the forest because of one tree.
Right.
And so I did not allow the mark of the beast to take over my chapter that I wrote on chapters 12, 13, and 14, which I think is primarily about revealing who the true enemy is. And the mark of the beast is in service to that, but the mark of the beast in and of itself, it gets more press than, frankly, I think what it deserves. I don't know that John intended for it to have the type of life and narrative arc that it has today.
Yeah, I think. Well, I for me, it's like, okay, this might be one of those weirdnesses that so bear with me for a moment. But so to me, that like, I think you might have underplayed it a little bit on the symbolic level, though. Even though I think your identification is right, because it definitely is about naming and identity. That part is right. Yeah. But I think there's a little bit, the fact that the number is 666 says more about the identity that it's associated with than I think maybe. And I'm not saying I'm right here, but this is my instinct, and I get this instinct comes certainly under the influence of Tomberg, because Tomberg talks about this idea of the satanic temptation being a temptation toward a closed world, and he specifically says that the nature of the closed world is that it wants to close itself off from the Sabbath, right? So six is the days of creation minus the Sabbath. So the 666 is a representation of this closed world of the serpent. So there does have this kind of other symbolic resonance. But I do think that the game of trying to identify particular persons is probably a misguided game. What Tomberg actually says is that it's just that what Tomberg identifies the Antichrist is just the natural course of horizontal evolution in the closed world of the serpent, where it's cut itself off from the influence of the vertical of participation in God. So
no, I find that interesting, especially because so I want to play with that a little bit. If his emphasis is right about this this closed, in a sense, this closed world, sans Sabbath, it would be interesting then that in Revelation 14:13, where the second blessing out of the seven comes in, it is, blessed are those who die in the Lord. Yes, says the Spirit, for they will rest from their labors. So in the very next chapter, which chapters 13 and 14 are speaking to each other, even within that, 7 verse couplet at the end of 13 into 14, 13, 16 through 18 is where we get the mark of the beast 666. But 14, 1 and 2 begins with this, 144,000, and we have the name of God or of the Father and the Lamb on their head. And so you do have this interplay, which is fascinating. And to kind of his point as well. I could actually see some of that play off. Now, what I do in the video is I demonstrate we are going to reduce the 666 down to, the gematria move of taking these numbers or these names and putting them into numbers. The most logical way of rendering 666 from my perspective is Therion, which is, the Greek word for beast, where if you
Right.
take those Greek, letters, put them into Hebrew and add it up, it's 666. But I would even take it a step further than I do in the videos.
Right.
So I've written on this elsewhere, but there's a very early textual variant in, I believe it's Pyaxyrhynchus 116, although I may be off on that, but probably not by too much fragments, but where it is actually 616. And in the fact
Right.
that fragment is so early, and we have in Irenaeus book 5, he does mention 616 as well. So
Right.
frankly, from a textual critical standpoint, it's kind of, if we're taking the most difficult reading, 616 would actually be more difficult than 666.
Right.
However, I think that there's a reason why 616 emerged so early. So 616, you can get to that number if you take therion, the word for beast, and use the genitive form, theriu, which actually in the context of Genesis 13, 16 through 18, theriu would be the closest referent to 666. Mm-hmm. And whenever you add that up, it's 616. And so I actually think that the early referent of 616 is a way of clarifying for communities that maybe even early on were starting to become confused, maybe trying to, even Irenaeus takes it, 666 and makes it Latinus. Like, so he says it's the Latin language. But I think the early textual variant was trying to actually point towards the word beast.
Bringing it back to the beast. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so too, because, also like that has so many levels of resonance if you return it back to that too, because especially if you think of like Christ as a representative of what it means to be truly human. Yeah. So the bestial then becomes a really kind of obvious symbolic antithesis of that, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like, so it's just like a failure to be human, essentially is what it's pointing toward. Yeah. And Tomberg, I think, is really great because he points out that essentially the temptation that is made is a false offer of freedom. That's the whole idea of the closed world. He uses the Ouroboros as the symbolic image of the closed world, and the image of the serpent inserting his tail into his mouth. And he does that, and he does that as an enticement to an offer of a false freedom. Huh. Because essentially the argument that he's making is that you can't really be free as long as the world is open to God and the Sabbath, because because everything will be attributed to God and you have nothing to call your own.
Yeah, and actually that image is also helpful as well, because Revelation 13 but also 17, evil in Revelation is always cannibalistic. Like it's always eating its own. So that image is actually quite profound. Even
and it also, which also allows you to, like, on a cosmic level, to contrast like bestial devouring with communion. Yep. Right? Absolutely. So it really becomes. So that's what I'm saying. It's like, there's like all of these layers of symbolic resonance that that actually happen. So it's like, it's actually, you're saying, what I'm saying is that it's not as, what you're saying isn't as underwhelming as you sold it to be. It's actually pretty amazing when you start thinking about the symbolic resonance of it. Yeah. You're actually, it's not actually lackluster or uninspiring at all. You're actually saying something really important.
Mm-hmm. No, and I appreciate that emphasis, and that's where I'm still reflecting on the separation of Sabbath. But there is this unique emphasis on that Sabbath.
After we're done, I'll send you a copy of that portion of the text so you can read it. It's
absolutely. But it is this, if we're going to go back to the extremes that we from obsession and then neglect versus work and then complete Sabbath, like Revelation does have this more holistic blending of them. Like I don't think that we, whenever the imagery of rest, 14, 13, 21, and 22, it doesn't mean that now we no longer have any work, because work in and of itself is also what makes us human. Like that's a Genesis 1 and 2 move, not a Genesis 3 result,
Right. Yeah. Right. Well, yeah. Then there's, but the thing is that Sabbath, I think in its truest, deepest metaphysical sense, is the place where work ceases to be work.
Yes.
And it's transformed into play. So
where the work is a manifestation of the union between us and God.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
All right. So tell me about, we got really sidetracked here, but I do
great.
this. Okay, good.
I love it.
People, some people are thrown off and some people get it. Okay. All right. So, go ahead, and if you want to, just for the sake of my audience, because we actually kind of started with some rabbit trails, but go ahead and tell my audience like what your primary thesis is here that you're arguing. Like, what is Revelation? What is it about? What is it for? What should we be doing with this text?
Yeah, so it was actually something that struck me just a couple years ago when I sat down to write this, and it was this idea that, the first 5 words of the book seem to actually state what it wants to talk about. This is the revelation of Jesus Christ. And I wanted to try to trace that theme all the way through the book and see if it was serious. Because typically, we get all kinds of sidetracked with predictions and these models of, from Rapture to, eclipses and blood red moons and Revelation. It's much more, the prophetic genre is much more concerned about the response of the people that is actually receiving the letter, their transformation. In one of the things I don't think I bring it up in the book, but I bring it up in the videos is, it's not that prophetic literature, Old or New Testament, never predicts at all. However, even just a quick linguistic look at the words prophecy, prophesy, or to prophesy, those words are only used in the context of a prediction 17% of the time, Old New Testament. So that means 83% of the time when a prophecy is being talked about, it's in service of a much greater goal than what we've reduced it down to. And because prophetic works always were written to either people that were in time periods of suffering or persecution, that they were either enduring or that they were compromising or they were in rebellion. Like prophets came to call the rebellious people to repentance. And Revelation 1:3 says, "Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy." Like it claims the genre. In the way that Revelation brings that call of transformation to the table is by painting vivid pictures of Jesus, constantly describing this the incarnation, this Christocentric logic of how to even process the world that we are living in, the realm of Rome, which the way I describe it is what Revelation's constantly doing then is trying to thin the veil. It's trying to, this veil that separates us from God, from our ability to see God in the world around us, the veil that separates humanity from divinity, and even frankly separates us from our own enemies. Revelation thins consistently to try to say, whoa, what you think you see actually is much more profound in both negative and in positive ways than what you've even been able to discern. So what I'm trying to do with thinning the veil is paint the pictures of Jesus as clear as possible, and not get sidetracked with things like trying to predict when Jesus is going to come back.
Yeah. So that's interesting. Another thing that when talking about prophecy in that way, and one of the other things that's always closely associated with prophecy is poetry.
Yeah.
Like there's a really close connection between poetry and prophecy. And I did this conversation like a few years back where I actually talked about the way that poetry is connected to the idea of witness. Because what a poet is trying to do is to communicate the real as the real, right? And you talked about painting a picture. Well, that's what a poet is trying to do with their words. They're trying to paint a picture so that you can see appearances that are normally hidden from you.
Yeah,
that's why great poetry always has a sense of epiphany.
Yep.
In it, and I think that's definitely connected to the spirit of prophecy and what's going on with prophecy, and that prophecy's primary function is always to make known that which is hidden.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
So, and in fact, even if it does have a predictive element, if that predictive element is not in service of making known that which is hidden, I'm not sure about what spirit is inspiring the prophecy, right?
Absolutely.
So.
Absolutely. And that's where, like, even when what you just said is exactly the poetic elements as well. It's exactly right. And that's why when you go back to Daniel, which Daniel is one of those books, that Revelation references or alludes to persistently. But it also is a book that really gives this beautiful wedding of narrative and apocalyptic. You know, halfway through the book, Daniel 7, it shifts into this poetic imagery that is trying to communicate things that are both beyond us, but by apprehending it through the poetry, it brings it down to a place that we realize it is very much right in front of us. But like you said, it's hard to see in the chaos of all that it is that is saturating us. So, but in Revelation's way of doing it, so like Daniel, there are clear predictive elements. So Daniel chapter 7, he sees these 4 beasts that the angel even tells him are 4 successive kingdoms. And even if you want to date Daniel to 2nd century BC, there still is this connection to this Rome-like figure that at least the Jewish reception of Daniel believed the 4th kingdom was Rome. I mean, this is 2nd Esdras. This is even Josephus. I mean, it's referring to the 4th kingdom of Daniel as Rome. So, but even with those predictive elements, the goal of Daniel was not to predict. The goal of Daniel was to actually bolster the Jewish communities in exile as they are trying to navigate the difficulties of Babylon or the Medo-Persians or the Greeks. Like it's always in service of something greater. Because
mere prediction doesn't tell you anything about what spirit inspired the prophecy. That's why.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And very rarely does mere prediction even communicate to you, therefore, what is required of you. You know, I use this example, I think, in the videos, but a lot is it's like, if you told me, Shane, you're going to die next Thursday, like what is required of me to walk across the street more haphazardly? Like, I don't know what you're calling me to heed. But that's one of the things all prophetic literature does, is it demands obedience to the revelation, to what it is that is being unveiled.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about some of the like the things that you kind of like clear up. I'm trying now to track between what's in the book and what's not. So I because I watched the videos today, I'm definitely going to start, because I don't think you talked about the rapture in the book either.
No, I don't. Mm-mm.
Okay, but I can't not ask you about that because I was raised Pentecostal. So
sure.
So tell me what you think about the rapture.
Yeah, and I do have an entire video on this that's in, I believe it's like maybe chapter 9 or something, or 8 of the book. So I do not believe in a rapture, which I know for some people I become immediately anathema. But I
Can I just comment on that really quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
I just like, we can't when we're talking about like speculative eschatology, we really can't allow that to be something that divides us. We just can't, because none of us know with any degree of certainty whether we're right or not, and we can't be so convinced that our interpretation is correct that we want to isolate from our brothers and sisters over something that's not really that consequential. Like, honestly, it's like, what your opinion is on the rapture doesn't really say much about you. There are good people. There are really good people who are wonderful Christians who believe in the rapture, and there are people who are not so good who do, and who don't. So
that is exactly right. That is exactly right. And that's one of the things I find so fascinating about whenever I say that, like, hey, I don't agree with the rapture. Like, I've literally had an email that ended where they were really upset about me not believing in the rapture, and it ended with them saying that I should have a millstone tied around my neck and dropped in the sea. Like, some people take it pretty intensely.
Right. Yeah.
But that's why I'm always like,
I'll say this to you because you were so personal and vulnerable in your book. I feel comfortable saying this, but this is a point of tension between my mother and myself, right?
Sure.
Because I'm Anglican now. And my mom is still very much Pentecostal, and she's completely irritated to varying degrees of frustration, depending on her mood, with the fact that I don't believe in a rapture. So
and that's why I have typically, whenever people ask me about it, I have no interest in convincing them that they should not.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Like I'm like, this is just where I'm at. And it's okay if you're not where I'm at, especially on this issue. My mentor used to tell me this whenever I was in graduate school. He said, before he passed, he said, Shane, the older I get and the more that I study, the less essentials that I have. And I remember at the time, I remember at the time thinking, oh no, man, the more I'm studying, the more I'm getting. And now at 43, I'm starting to go, I'm going, he had way more wisdom than I had at 23. Like because it is. And the way we hold our positions should be a lot more charitable, knowing our limitations than what we typically do.
I want you to take this in the right spirit, because this is certainly this could be a critique I could turn on myself. Those of us who are say more intellectually inclined, there's a temptation for us to think that those things matter more than they do, because we're good at it. We have more skill in that area than most people. So it becomes a source of personal power for us, and it's something that we can abuse because of that. And so there's actually a temptation there.
That's right.
And when we become overly obsessed with being right, it can actually be quite destructive for us.
Yeah. And I even on this issue of the rapture, even having taught it, and again, I quote my mentor, every couple of years, I kind of stop and have one of these like, do I really believe that? But my mentor told me, he said, Shane, never write a book if you're not willing to write the very next book and say, everything I wrote in that last book was wrong. He said, if you can't do that, don't write.
Right. No, that's really good. You had a wise mentor.
Yeah, he was something special. But but no, I do not hold to a rapture theology for two reasons: one historical and one exegetical.
Okay.
So historically, you can trace the rapture theology, and people love to try to expand what I mean by rapture theology to the idea of premillennialism as a whole, and that's not what I'm saying. There is historic premillennialism goes all the way back to second, third century, and what I mean by that is the idea of the 1,000-year reign on earth. That's not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about rapture theology.
Right. So you can believe in chiliasm without holding to a rapture, like Bulgakov does, for example.
Exactly right. Which a lot of the early church did. Yeah. Chiliasm wasn't something that was like, was even how do I want to say it? It wasn't anomalous in the early church. It was one of the major strands. Right. However, this idea of the church being plucked out, especially before things get really bad, that is much more recent. And the more robust way of understanding the rapture theology can be traced back to around 1830 with a woman by the name of Margaret MacDonald, who put herself into a self-induced fever. And then from that had a prophetic trance where she writes down this idea of the church being pulled out right as things are starting to get bad, which leads into Jesus coming back. And John Nelson Darby, the connection between them is somewhat debated. However, they were in the same region at the same time, and they came to the similar teaching. So whether or not they cross-pollinated,
Ireland, right?
Scotland.
Oh, Scotland. Yeah. Okay, right. Yeah.
It was actually funny. I was at the British New Testament conference in 2011, and we were in the Revelation section, and the concept of the rapture came up, and they all were like, how do you Americans believe this? And I was like, hey, y'all brought it to us.
You brought it to
us. Like, this came from you all.
Yeah. My Grail Country co-host, Sherry, she was raised in the Plymouth Brethren. So.
Okay. Yeah, John Nelson Darby. That was his primary, in a period of about 15 to 18 years in the 1830s up to around the mid, 1840s. He had 6 to 8 trips over from Scotland to America, primarily speaking to the Plymouth Brethren, and he was teaching the rapture theology, and that began to influence quite a few different strands in the Americas, which eventually influenced a guy by the name of Cyrus Schofield, who gave us the first reference Bible, which is super helpful,
which was all hugely popular.
Oh man. I mean, and frankly, it's a wonderful tool. Like, I mean, I encourage my students, like, especially when you're starting out, like, man, if you don't know the context of the inspired words, it'd be great to have something right below that gave you a little bit of like a, of a head start on how to process what's happening. The problem is that people weren't, they sometimes don't distinguish between, scripture and then the commentary on it. And so it became more popularized with the Scofield Reference Bible. Dwight L. Moody, who is one of the great evangelists of the 20th century, he believed in a rapture theology, and everywhere he went and planted churches, he took the rapture theology with him. Whenever I lived in Scotland to do my PhD, we went to a church that was founded by Dwight L. Moody. Like,
right.
Like he was not small when it came to his reach. But his influence, his evangelistic influence, also influenced a guy by the name of Billy Graham, who wrote in the 1970s Approaching Hoofbeats, espousing a rapture theology, around the same time as Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth, which in the decade of the 70s outsold the Bible worldwide. And then you have
I was raised on a steady diet of Hal Lindsey.
And that's where even the Apache helicopter references can come from.
I guarantee you, there's a friend of mine who's like part of the same internet subculture that I am, who will make a comment about the helicopters in the comment. Anytime I do anything on Revelation, it says something about the helicopters.
I mean, how Lindsey's reach was especially at a time whenever you kind of parallel at what's happening. With Vietnam and some of the Cold War stuff that was happening, the tension in the air at that time period was so palpable that something that was espousing this idea of lifting us out before it really gets bad and making all this, it made sense. And then, in the 80s, you have Edgar Whisenant and his, 88 Reasons Why the Rapture will happen in 1988, followed up by the riveting 89 Reasons Why it'll happen in 1989. And then 1990, Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins get together and they fictionalize this teaching that at that point was about 130, 160 years old into the Left Behind series, which was wildly popular, even spawning off movies with Kirk Cameron and Nicolas Cage. And but the thing I always try to point out is to say, even though it is very popular, it actually isn't what the church has believed that in the last 2,000 years. Like, it's not the dominant view of the church the last 2,000 years. It may be foreign to hear that the rapture hasn't been the church's teaching for 2,000 years because of the good marketing of Left Behind series and dispensationalism. But the reality is that no, the church has not taught a rapture. Actually, the church teaches a lot more about that we will go through time periods of suffering. And that is promised far more than this idea of being pulled out before they're suffering.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. Yeah, precisely. Yeah. Yeah. I just don't even know. Yeah. People hold that opinion. God bless them. But yeah. I was going to ask something and I forgot. You were talking about, okay. So here's one thing. Okay, I want to say something in favor of the people who kind of like are very focused on thinking that they're in apocalyptic times, because they're not wrong about that, right? Sure, because all times are apocalyptic. That's right. So if we could just maybe shift the energy from being caught up in speculating about who the bad guys are, because that's what it's mostly a game of spot the baddies.
Sure, right.
Right. And most of the time, if we're playing spot the baddies, we should be looking inward.
That's exactly right.
So but you're not wrong to feel like that you're living in apocalyptic times, that you're asking, or that you are, that your world might come to an end, because worlds come to an end all the time.
That's right. Like,
it's a repeated pattern of worlds coming to an end and new worlds starting. Until we get it right. Until we get it right, that pattern's going to keep repeating itself. Absolutely. So can you talk a little bit about like the kind of cyclical patterning in the book?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why in the book of Revelation, Rome is referenced as Babylon. Because I think there's a part of what it's saying to the first century churches is, we've seen this before. Like, this isn't new, what is happening with Rome. This is the same, and it's even the same tools that are being used. This confluence of deception and violence and worship is something that we have seen in iterations of empires, not just all the way back to Babylon, but all the way back to, the movements of Genesis, from Genesis 3 on.
Yeah, it seems to be almost at times like a deliberate challenge to your concept of the linear progression of time. Like, it wants to shake you out. I think it wants to shake you out of that by making these by making these shifts that make you confused about, like, well, wait a minute. If you're trying too much to fit it to a linear pattern, you're going to end up being confused because it's actually trying to break you out of that kind of pattern of thinking altogether.
Absolutely. I think even in the introduction of the book, I show how Revelation comes to the end of the world 7 different times, because coming to the end of the world is not the point. That's a given. It's every time Revelation comes to the end of the world, though, it is building this call for us, as you even said, to stare into the mirror, to find the satanic temptation that we are individually are falling to. But a lot of the times we cast it onto the empires, or we put so much faith in the empires.
Right.
Like there's this interesting dichotomy, that we see even in the Western world today.
Oh, for sure.
We either think that the goal is to tear down an empire as if that's going to solve something, or to worship worship the empire as if all of our hope is in who is sitting in the presidency.
Right. Yeah. No, for sure. Yeah, definitely.
But Revelation challenges both.
Yeah.
It simultaneously says the empires are going to fall. That's a given. Like that's always what's happened. But it also says this, and yet that is way too small of a goal for what the kingdom is being called to. Our goal is to destroy the unholy trinity behind the empires, the dragon and his 2 beasts. Our goal is to target them, and there's only certain weapons that actually work against Satan and his minions. And so that's where I talk about in the book, even with our enemy. Like I use the enemy, our individual enemy, as an example. Is like there's 2 ways you can deal. You can kill an enemy or obliterate an enemy. You can either murder them, or you can convert them into a friend.
Yeah. Attention. That was it. That immediately caught my attention in the text, by the way, when you said that, because there's another place where I've read that. Tomberg actually says this.
No kidding.
One of the letters of Meditations on the Tarot. He actually says that the true meaning of to conquer is actually to turn to turn an enemy into a friend, because and he uses an analogy. He talks about the difference between the First and Second World Wars.
Okay.
He's like, okay, so Germany was not conquered at the end of World War I. They were defeated, but they were not conquered. They were not conquered until the end of the Second World War, because at the end of the Second World War, we accomplished the feat of turning an enemy into a friend.
Wow.
And then they were truly conquered, because they were no longer our enemy. So same exact kind of line of reasoning. So
yeah, and mine is rooted in my reflection of the ministry of Saul before he was Paul,
right?
And the conversion of Saul into Paul.
Right.
He had the clear tactic when he was Saul of killing Christians. I mean, he is the one that took responsibility for the murdering of Stephen.
You could also use the destruction of the nations that precedes their offering up of their glory too, right?
Yeah.
Within the text, so it's like there's this theme of like things are destroyed, but then they reappear in another form. So it's like false versions of things are what are being threatened with destruction.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So,
and that's where the thinning of the veil is. We're destroying the illusion that ultimately is even convinced us that God is far from us.
Right. Yeah. And you, in the process of talking about this, you talk about this idea of the unholy trinity. And you saw, and which you refer to the dragon and the 2 different beasts as composing that. Like, do you want to explicate what you mean by that? Because I don't think that you want to like propose some kind of actual fundamental dualism, that you're using that as as a kind of symbol to point towards something.
Yeah, it's much more of a narratival rhetoric that John employs than it is a metaphysical argument.
Right.
But the rhetorical import, and this actually in Revelation studies is a pretty big distinction. Typically, when you read Revelation scholars, they'll argue that the two beasts are these kind of two almost forces within the Roman Empire. They'll use this kind of like imperial cult as the second beast, and the first one is kind of like the dominance of Rome. What I'm specifically trying to do there is to say, but the problem is when you take the beast imagery and you trace it through the entire book, there seems to be a distinct, even though they are like Rome, the beast imagery, they are distinct. Like the prostitute is astride the beast in 17, and the prostitute is destroyed in 17, but the beast keeps riding on. The beast isn't destroyed till 19. So there has to be something that both unites with Rome, but exists beyond Rome in order for all the imagery to make sense together.
Right.
And so, however, I would say this: where people are getting that makes sense, because in Daniel chapter 7, every beast from the sea equals a kingdom. Right. But that's where one of the things I tried to pull out in the book is, but John, he allows the revelation of Jesus Christ to even help us reinterpret at times Old Testament images that we thought we had solved. So the Daniel beasts equal the kingdom. If we only had the beast from the sea in Revelation 13, I would say, okay, that's Rome. But when he adds the beast of the earth, he's evolving the imagery in a way that is unnecessary from the Daniel 7 imagery. Right. And why is he doing that? I think it's to make a distinction, is to say, listen, you're dealing with really kind of like you're dealing with two enemies, but they're really actually all flowing from one. Right. We think that the primary thing to fight against is Rome, and therefore everything we think has to do with destroying Rome or dealing with Rome. But he says there is a greater enemy that has existed before Rome and will exist after Rome, and it is in mockery of the Holy Trinity. I mean, it is a parody of it. And so that's where the dragon.
Look how it treats its own, right? Yeah. Because several times you point out the way the evil treats evil. Yep. In the text. I mean, it's like you can see in that how different it is in the way that it behaves. Because it doesn't.
Absolutely.
There's no. It's just it's just a war of all against all.
Yeah. I mean, that's where I think in the chapter on the trumpets, where, whenever the keys to hell are handed over to this destroyer figure, he unlocks hell, and hell tortures its own. It's like, this is who we are up against. Right.
Yeah. So that's always good to be. That's always good to have as a reminder too, because it keeps us from overemphasizing our squabbles with one another. If we can see that there's a greater enemy lurking behind the scenes. So.
Yep. I mean, I think that if we truly believe that the enemy was actually this dragon and the unholy, this unholy trinity of sorts. Yeah. We would treat our enemies.
I'm not holding you to that. I didn't think you meant it literally. I'm not holding you to that.
No, right.
Yeah. First of all, I will confess here. Since yours, I was once referred to as a member of an unholy trinity.
Oh, no kidding.
When I was in college at Thomas Aquinas College, me and the two guys that I hung out with the most, there was a group of girls who warned off some visiting potential incoming freshmen to avoid us, and they referred to us as the unholy trinity, because they're like, if you hang around those guys, they'll be a corrupting influence. Stay away from them. So it's like,
so that imagery was very close to you autobiographically.
Like, hey, I've heard that before.
Yeah, that's definitely not what I'm arguing for. But, but we would. I mean, I think we would even engage, politics across the aisle different if we truly believed that the enemy was not that person. And I think that there's hopefully in the book there's something that would be somewhat sobering for especially America itself, where it's just like I genuinely don't know if in the church or outside the church if we know who the enemy is anymore.
Right.
I don't even know if we know.
So yeah, we're so invested in it. Yeah. And yeah, it's it gets really troubling. Yeah, I understand. And the funny thing is though, it's like so much of it is just a result of like, I guess get this feeling that very few people like even know why they think the things that they do, right? It's like we're in a situation where it's like ideas have a hold of people.
That's right.
And they're not, and that we have to be able to separate the people from the ideas that have a hold of them, because they're not reflections of who they really are.
That's right.
So yeah.
I mean, if Satan can get us to not know who the enemy is, and B, to the functioning then off of automatic responses that are cookie cuttered for every situation, he owns.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to plead guilty to this too. This is not something I'm just accusing other people to do. I catch myself just like repeating something because it's something I've said over and over again that I have not thought out clearly at all. And if I were pressed on it and we're being honest, I would say, yeah, I don't really know why I think that.
That's right. No, and usually the people that are willing to press on me like that are they're more gifts than they are threats, and that's if we could all receive that, we all might function a little different.
Yeah, I had a conversation with a friend of mine that is in the same spaces today, and that was and I had to like, oh, okay, like in the course of this conversation with him, I had to admit that I've always gotten Kierkegaard wrong.
And what a beautifully sobering moment. Like,
yeah, right. I wasn't upset about it. It's like, okay, now I get it. It's like I bounced off of Kierkegaard in my teens and never really had much use for him. And he was a big into Kierkegaard, and he was able to present Kierkegaard's ideas to me in a way that like it's like, oh, okay. There was no point in me just like continuing to raise the same old objections when I was able to see where he was coming from and to see it in a new light.
But I will say, I mean, what you're even describing there, my thought was, but if you are free from self-preservation, which is the grammar of evil. Evil's grammar is self-preservation at all costs.
Yes.
But if you're free from that, then even being wrong isn't a threat to who you are. It's actually an opportunity for you to become someone different. And that's beautiful.
That's right. Yeah. Well, yeah, actually, Chris Green, who's a mutual friend of, I don't know if you know Dr. Green or not, but he's a friend of your brother's and mine. Okay. We've had Jordan and Chris and I have had some conversations together.
Awesome.
But Chris has this great sermon, and the title of the sermon is "God is Not a Master," and he talks about how the ultimate goal of the one who seeks mastery is to protect themselves from death.
Wow.
Like that is their motivation. So that right there is like, that is the root of our idolatry of power. And I think Tomberg is correct in saying that the root of all idolatry is the idolatry of power. I mean, that's right. That's the source of it all.
Yeah.
So you talked a little bit, a little while ago, and I want to get back to that because you talked about how self-referencing the biblical text is. And one of the things that you mentioned that you did is that you actually mapped out, in the process of studying Revelation, you mapped out all of the different Old Testament allusions that are in the text. Can you talk about how many did you find, and what do you what kind of insight do we get from understanding those cross references?
Yeah, I have. It's some like 90 some odd pages. Actually, I even when I did it years ago, I even included extra biblical sources. But the Old Testament sources, I found over 516 allusions in the book of Revelation, and Revelation only has 404 verses.
Right.
So in over one time every verse, Revelation is assuming you know the Old Testament story. Like it is.
And the non-biblical, are those like non-canonical books that were referenced? Okay.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if it was like, Greek pagan texts or non-canonical books.
No, it would still be within like the Jewish community, so from like the Old Testament pseudepigrapha, apocrypha, like I have those parallels as well. But again, my
there was
perception.
there was no canon when the apostle was writing it.
Right. It's but it's the stories that saturated the Judeo-Christian communities.
Right.
But yeah, so over 516 allusions, it's assuming you know the story before the story. However, the thing that I think, this is where I think Revelation scholars, where I'm asking us to explore a different way of approaching this, is typically Revelation scholars, and we do this in the New Testament as a whole, but if we find a parallel to the Old Testament, we kind of figure out it's like this one-to-one. We use the historical grammatical to go to the Old Testament, what was the context, and then that, in a sense, dictates how we can then see the parallel in the New Testament. That's just not what seems to be assumed, in Revelation, and I would even argue in the New Testament. Isaiah 7:14, the context of that has very little to do with the virgin birth, but in Matthew, it is essentially talking about the virgin birth. Right. And instead of, and I have this in my circles, sometimes they'll say, well, but that's the way the Bible interprets it, but that's inspired by the Spirit. My response back is, but if the Bible's interpreting it that way, I should also adopt its hermeneutic.
Right.
Like not just its conclusions, but its methodology.
Right. It suggests a difference between the methods of interpretation that they were using and the methods that we're using.
Right.
Yeah.
And I find this in the book of Revelation, that every Old Testament text, John clearly knows, and he clearly is wanting it to be incorporated into the story of the revelation of Christ, but it is never divorced from. It is not a parallel that comes through and bypasses what Jesus contributes. Right. And in that passing through Christ, at times the image is completely inverted. And this really came out whenever I'm wrestling with Isaiah 63 and in the winepress of God's fury in Revelation 14 is, and I make the argument in the book, but all of the from linguistic to imagery leading up to Revelation 14, all of it points to that actually it's not the nations that are being crushed in the winepress of God's fury in chapter 14, but it's followers of Christ. So this imagery of the blood flowing as high as the horse's bridle for 1,600 stadia, which we typically, if you see it as the winepress of God's fury, it is brutal. But if you see it actually through the revelation of Jesus Christ, or through, frankly, the cross of Christ, and we are the ones being trampled on behalf of our enemies, it becomes this image of grace. And it becomes simultaneously a call for us to come and die. So the Old Testament saturates the text, but it doesn't saturate the text unmolested from the revelation of Jesus Christ.
So, okay. One thing that I let me just get to some things that I don't think you raised in any of the videos or in the text, but I just want to ask you because I want to get an idea, because I want to get a sense of it. So, we talked about you not believing in a rapture earlier. What is your reading of the parousia? In what register do you want to interpret that?
Yeah. So there would be two ways I would respond to that. One would be linear, and then one would be a question of time. So the linear is, I believe the New Testament teaches there's nothing that needs to happen that's required now that Christ is dead and now the temple is destroyed. There's nothing that's required to happen in order for the parousia to happen. So if I'm speaking from a linear perspective, I'm not waiting on a sign. I'm not waiting on an event. It's just literally when God moves. That's all we're waiting on.
Right.
I will though, if I'm gonna totally be completely honest, the definition of time, I think also has to be brought into the equation at some point.
Yes, for sure.
Especially from an apocalyptic standpoint, time doesn't function in the way in which we.
Well, the reason I asked this question is because I think it's automatically implied by the way that you've primarily chosen to approach the text. It's okay, if we're going to approach this text as something that is calling to transform you and to transform your world, then I think it does beg that question of asking, like, well, how would you think about linear time, and when is this happening? And I know, like, some of my Orthodox friends, like, very much have the opinion that saints are already living in the eschaton.
Sure.
Right? And so I think that, like, we shouldn't, rather than trying to predict when the apocalypse is going to happen as an event in time or event in history, what needs to happen is we need to allow the text to transform us right here, right now.
Yeah.
Without delay.
Yep. Absolutely right. And I do think that there needs to be more done in eschatology with the definition of time, especially as expressed in apocalyptic texts, and its therefore impact on the parousia as a whole. But I do try to bring out in the book that space and time and Revelation do not function the way that they typically function. Like, cosmology is collapsed.
We talked about that a little bit ago in the conversation. It's like, it's pretty clear. Like, it's wanting to shake up the text is clearly wanting to shake up your linear view of time.
Absolutely right.
So one of the interpretations that M.L. Bach, the anthroposophist, and Bulgakov, the Orthodox theologian, agree on, strangely enough, is they both want to read Revelation chapter 4 and 5 as a New Testament version of what's happening in Genesis.
Huh.
So Bulgakov, they're both going to point to the fact that the text actually kind of tells you that this is the case. Because later on in Revelation, again, it's not presenting things in a linear fashion. It tells you when the Lamb was slain, before the foundations of the world.
Absolutely,
which is your clue that what's being talked about in chapter 4 and 5 are clearly happening in the heavenlies.
Yep.
And because of that reference to the Lamb being slain before the foundation of the world, it's letting you know that it is the creation, and that what John says in his gospel about the creation of the world, that it's through Christ, is true. Which of course ties to your brother's work.
Yeah, yeah.
Because Maximus actually argues that creation happens on the cross.
Right. And honestly, and what we're dealing with there is not just at that point in time, but we're also dealing with space. And that's why, for me, cosmology as a whole is being called into question, the not just the linear, but even the spatial.
Right.
Because in chapters 4 and 5, it's not just that there's this distortion of time. When is this happening? But you also have John, who was on the island of Patmos, is present in the heavenlies. He actually walks through the door in chapter 4, verse 1.
So this is the perfect time for me to tell you why my channel is called Grail Country. It's actually it's a reference to a line in Wagner's Parsifal, where Gurnemanz is talking to, and Parsifal are talking, and there's this line that they're talking about in the region of the Grail. Right? In the region of the Grail, here is the place where space becomes time, or where time becomes space. Excuse me.
Okay.
And so that's like that whole idea of the region of the Grail country. That's what I'm kind of like talking about. Is this like this kind of this weird interplay where in this space where time becomes space.
Okay. Well, and that's what I even love about that connection you just made there is that it reminds me of John 17, where eternal life, which is a designation of time without end, which is therefore dependent upon a definition of time, is to know God. It's an actual intimacy.
Yes.
So now all of a sudden our concept of both space and time are not just being collapsed, they're being Christocentrically oriented.
Yeah.
That is where you are right with the Maximus the Confessor.
Yeah, that reminds me of Jensen's line about time being a double helix with Christ at its center.
Yes. Well, my friend and I were talking about this not too long ago, and he even made the suggestion that the Transfiguration. We assume that the Transfiguration, that like Moses and Elijah are appearing. He actually argued to me. He goes, no, if space and time don't function that way, Moses may be up on Sinai.
Correct.
And Elijah may be in their time,
that's right.
But they're encountering Christ in Matthew 17.
That's right.
And then this moves into Ephesians, where he even says, we are currently seated in the heavenlies right now.
Right.
And so in Christ and Christ in us, even that is spatial reorientation, because how can a person that has no boundaries be boundaried, like in the incarnation, but then even crazier, live inside of me? And now we're in Colossians, that the mystery is Christ.
Well, it also means
us.
that our Christian forebears were not wrong in thinking that the apocalypse was arriving in their time, because
that's right.
Because in as much as they became saints, it did.
That's right. No, that's exactly right. And that's where I think some of the definitions of space and time that apocalyptic texts in particular wrestle with need to be taken more seriously in our understanding of what the parousia is as a whole.
Yeah, that's right. All right.
Yeah.
All right. That's good. It's good. I thought I might weird you out with that one.
Oh, this is great. I love this.
Okay. Yeah. Do you have any questions for me?
Oh, man. Yeah. I would say maybe one of the things, even just reflecting on thinning the veil, if you could write an 11th chapter, what would you write it on?
Oh, I think the conversation we just had, I think that's where it would go. It's like, I think that's what needs open-ended. It's like, okay, like we're all in agreement that the purpose of this book is to transform us into and to bring us into the presence of Christ. So I think we need to address that. Like, what does that mean? And I think that's like kind of the follow-up for me, is natural follow-up. Yeah.
So then I have another question. Okay.
Go for it. Man.
So
I've asked you plenty of.
And this one's more, ecclesiastical. So as an Anglican, how would you wish, or if you could, put this before, how would you wish revelation could play more of a role in the Anglican, maybe liturgical calendar or the practices or just the people as a whole?
Oh, that's a really good question. I would say, I think we do a pretty good job with it. I think, because I think like the Orthodox Church, I think you can see it reflected in our liturgy, like kind of the structure of the text is reflected in our liturgical practices. So I would say that is true. But I think unlike the Orthodox, we don't completely ignore the text. Like it's the text of Revelation still does appear in our readings, so we do engage with the text. I think that I would like to see like the idea of treating the text as a spiritual exercise, like really catch on. I know you talk about in your book, you do have some exercises where you recommend Lectio Divina. I think Revelation is a perfect text for Lectio Divina. I really do. Yeah. So that's I just like engaging with what the text is asking us to try to do. I would say.
Well, because I actually just spent a couple weeks ago. I was at the Pusey House in Oxford. I stayed there on site there. My friend's the assistant chaplain there, and I'm looking at we're sitting in the service, and I'm going like, Anglicans, their church services seem to be, at least in that Oxford space, you almost seem uniquely positioned to engage the imagery of Revelation. I'm sitting in this side, which is separated with an open air with the cross in the middle, but it's separated from where the actual Eucharist would be kept.
Right.
And I'm going, so I have to pass through the veil of Christ to get to where the Eucharist is as somebody on this side. I'm like, every time you sit in here, you're engaging some of the imagery that Revelation brings down.
Well, we're embodied creatures, so that's why I think we need that dimension. That's why you need that dimension. And I think here's the thing: is let me introduce the concept to you. Actually, so the internet community the broader internet community that I'm a part of, it's referred to as TLC. And the kind of the central figure in this community is a CRC minister named Paul Vanderclay.
Okay.
And Paul has introduced this concept of the idea of the metagelical, and what he's talking about, how there's this thing going on in the evangelical space where there is this kind of like expanding of the boundaries of what can be discussed within the evangelical tent. So, for example, I had a young evangelical gentleman on not too long ago. His name was Luke. Mm-hmm. And we had a discussion about why Protestants should care about Mary.
Huh. Yeah.
And it was a really good conversation. And that's the kind of, and I'll give you an example that happened in my church, right? I'm Anglican, as I mentioned. Well, my church, we pray for all the churches in my community all the time. And we always specifically mention the Olympia Christian Reformed Church because our priest has a friendship with their associate pastor, and they also hosted. I had a conference for this community that I've been telling you about that was hosted in Olympia, and we used their building as a venue.
Oh,
and
wow.
So there's a close connection there between the two churches, and so we always pray for them. But then also when the new pope was elected, we prayed for the pope in my Anglican church. So this is the spirit of this kind of metagelical kind of thing that Paul is describing. So I think that and Protestants discovering that without necessarily going into a different tradition, right? Evangelical Protestants, without necessarily leaving their own tradition, find nourishment in other streams of Christianity. Yeah. And I think that's a really good thing. And I think that the embodied practices of highly liturgical traditions are really great. And I think that I think you'll see more and more evangelical churches that will adopt maybe some forms of liturgy that'll be more embodied than in the past.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's been about a month or so ago, I sat down for a 2-hour conversation with a pastor in St. Joseph's, Missouri named Brian Zond, who came out of the charismatic movement and is now, he has he took me into his worship service. You have all the contemporary, evangelical.
I know Brian. He's a universalist, right?
He would never claim the title.
He is, though.
He was adamant to me he would not claim that title because I asked
that's
him.
Fine.
But you have the drums and you have the electric guitars and then you have these modern icons, from Ivanka. I can't remember her last name, but from it's actually one of them is on the front of Jordan's book.
Oh yeah. She's a beautiful icon. Yeah.
And I'm sitting there going so wait a minute, your church was birthed out of a charismatic movement. But you have a traditional altar at the front and icons, and you go by the liturgical calendar, but you're still really holding on to the evangelical, contemporary worship. And he goes, hey man, my generation fought for those drums to be in here. I'm not giving them up.
Right. Yeah. Well, we have a very strong. Yeah, there's a strong charismatic element that's in my church too. So it's interesting. These lines are. The laity is blurring the lines regardless of what the various church hierarchies, that's just what's going on. And I think that part of it is a product that we just have. Part of it is product of the technology we're using to communicate now. It's people are being exposed to more ideas. I think there's more of a curiosity and openness to new ideas that come from other places, and people are experimenting, and new forms are being introduced, and we're learning from each other in a really, really cool way. So,
yeah, no, and I think that's to me, that's a part of the tradition I come from, which is at its core was a unity movement. Right. Although sometimes I always kind of poke at us and say, sometimes our unity has gotten a little more territorial than I was hoping. But then the second thing I would say is I think what you're describing is also the vision of Revelation. This every tribe, tongue.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah,
it's this coming together of our expressions of obedience to Christ, and
it's just a reminder of the kind of unity we're being called into, right? Because it's not the unity that we find in Christ is not a unity that is in competition with difference. In fact, it is as your brother points out in his book, it's the source of. It's the source of both the unity and the difference.
That's right.
So
that's right. Yeah. Which is, what universities were always supposed to be to begin with, but even that's gotten a little bit astray. So
yeah. All right. This has been a great conversation, Shane.
Hey,
I really appreciate you coming on and talking to me today. Might have you again and back again in the future if you're.
I would love it. Absolutely.
I think what I got to do, one of these days I got to get you and Jordan on at the same time. I got to find an excuse to get you guys both on at the same time. Maybe I'll get JD in too. I'll have the whole gang.
That'd be awesome. Let's do it.
Yeah. JD's up next. I'm gonna be talking to him about his new book soon.
Oh,
so,
he's
all right.
He is as much fun as you can have. That's for sure.
Yeah, he's great. He's fun. You're fun too, Shane.
Well, I appreciate it, Nate. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for writing a beautiful book. And I will make sure to recommend it to all of my viewers and to all of my family and friends. And
awesome.
appreciate you joining me today on Real Country.
Thank you.